On this episode of Black Girl Gone, I tell the story of 19-year-old Tynesha Stewart, who was murdered on March 15th, 2007 in Houston, Texas. At the time, Tynesha was a freshman at Texas A&M University. But in March, she came back to Houston for spring break. The day she was last seen, she met up with her ex-boyfriend. But he claimed that she left his apartment on her own after an argument. 6 days after she vanished, a confession would lead to the gruesome truth behind what happened to Tynesha. This is Tynesha's story. Tynesha Stewart's story is a devastating one. She was a young woman with her entire life ahead of her, full of hope and ambition for the future. At just 19 years old, she had already accomplished so much, and those who loved her believed that she was destined for greater things. But instead of her dreams coming to life, her story ended in unimaginable heartbreak. Before tragedy struck, Tynesha was more than just her accomplishments, however. She was a beloved daughter, sister, and friend, with a kind spirit and a life full of promise, cut short far too soon. Tynesha Stewart was born in Galveston, Texas on July 10, 1987. One of 6 children, she grew up in Aldine, Texas, a community just outside of Houston. When Tynesha was just 6 years old, her father passed away, leaving her to face the challenges of life without him. But despite everything, Tynesha stood out. Even at a young age, her intelligence and her determination were impossible to ignore. In high school, she managed the girls' basketball team while also working a part-time job at a Pizza Hut, which she kept for almost all 4 years. She stayed busy with other extracurricular activities too, but that never stopped her from excelling academically. When Tynesha was just 16 years old and a junior in high school, she met a man named Timothy Shepard. Timothy was 24 at the time and worked at the Pizza Hut also. Now, while the age gap definitely raised some eyebrows, Timothy quickly became a significant part of Tynesha's life. It's not exactly clear how people around her felt about their relationship, and I'm sure there were some who side-eyed it, but in the end, the age gap would turn out to be the least of their problems. People close to Tynesha started to notice that Timothy was controlling, which might explain why he was drawn to a high school student in the first place, but over time, the controlling behavior escalated. He wasn't just controlling anymore. He became jealous and possessive, and those behaviors would continue to get worse. But even with the distractions that Timothy brought into her life, she never let it affect school. When she graduated from Nimitz High School, she was in the top 10% of her class. Her hard work and dedication had paid off in 2005 when she had won a highly competitive scholarship. Out of hundreds of applicants, Tynesha was one of only 15 students selected. And with that scholarship, she was able to follow her dreams, and she enrolled as a freshman at Texas A&M University, where she studied civil and chemical engineering. Her family was incredibly proud of her. After all of the obstacles she had overcome, it was clear that Tynesha had a bright future ahead of her. Once in college, she began to realize that she deserved better than what she had been dealing with when it came to Timothy. He was abusive and controlling and didn't seem to really have much going for himself at 26, 27 years old. College opened up Tynesha's world, and so at the beginning of her freshman year, she broke things off with Timothy. Her friend said that she was still in love with him, but she wanted more. Timothy, however, did not want the relationship to end, and he did not handle the breakup well, according to Tynesha's mother. Even after the breakup, Timothy's controlling behavior didn't stop. He called her dorm and cell phone multiple times a day, and their conversations often turned to arguments. Despite Tynesha being away at college, it seemed Timothy couldn't let go. The constant phone calls became a burden for her, and it was clear that their relationship had taken a toll on her. But she had made her decision. She did not want to be with Timothy anymore. After her first semester, when Tynesha returned home, there was a noticeable shift. Her family and friends said she seemed more social, and she'd even started talking to a student from another college named Mark. For a brief moment, it seemed like Tynesha might finally be moving on. Timothy's call stopped, and she appeared to be enjoying her freedom. But by February 2007, Timothy started calling Tynesha again. His presence in her life was becoming harder to escape. As spring break approached, Tynesha confided in others that she was worried about going back to Houston. She was scared that Timothy would follow her around, and her fears were not unfounded. His jealousy and possessiveness had only intensified, and Tynesha had every reason to feel uneasy about returning home. But even with the growing fear, neither she nor anyone in her life knew how far things would go. By the time spring break arrived in March 2007, nothing had changed. But despite her concerns about Timothy's behavior, Tynesha decided to return to Houston for a break. And when she was back home, she started making plans to enjoy her time off. On Thursday, March 15th, she had plans with friends to attend a concert at the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo. She was also looking forward to traveling to Padre Island for the last part of her break. It was a chance to unwind and just have fun. On March 14th, the day before the concert, Tynesha spent time visiting with Mark and some other friends. And then later that day, she went to the apartment of her close friend Lois. It seemed like Tynesha was able to put her worries aside and focus on being with the people who made her happy. But Timothy's looming presence wasn't something she could escape for long. Once he knew Tynesha was back in Houston, he began calling her, trying to convince her to see him in person. The night of the 14th, Tynesha decided to stay at Lois's house, but Timothy had convinced her to let him pick her up from there so that they could talk. On the morning of March 15th, Timothy showed up at Lois's apartment to pick up Tynesha. Now, for some reason, she decided to leave her phone behind, telling Lois that she'd be back soon. But she never returned. When she didn't show up for the concert later that day, Lois started to worry. Something didn't feel right. She reached out to Tynesha's family to see if they had heard from her. That's when she learned that Tynesha's younger sister had spoken to her around noon that day, and Tynesha had told her that she was with Timothy. That was the last time that anyone in her family heard her voice. As hours passed with no sign of Tynesha, worry quickly turned into panic. She didn't have her phone, so there was no point in calling her, and none of her friends had seen her or heard from her since the morning of the 15th. Lois and Tynesha's family knew that something wasn't right. She wouldn't have just disappeared without letting someone know where she was, and the last person they knew her to be with was Timothy. On March 19th, Tynesha's mother, Gail, contacted the Houston police to report her daughter missing. After receiving the report, an officer was dispatched to her home so that she could be interviewed. Once the officer arrived, she told them what she knew and that the last person she knew her daughter to be with was Timothy. And so she also tells them about Timothy's history of being controlling and abusive. After learning about Timothy and the fact that no one had seen or heard from Tynesha in 4 days, it was a huge red flag. And so officers decided to go to Timothy's apartment to see what he knew about her whereabouts. And so Gail and Tynesha's friend Lois accompanied him to the apartment. When they arrived at Timothy's apartment, he answered the door and spoke with the officer. When asked about Tynesha's whereabouts, Timothy claimed that she had been there the previous Thursday, but they had an argument about her having a new boyfriend, and she left, walking away from the apartment. The officer asked if he could take a look around, and Timothy agreed. The apartment was a mess, but one thing that immediately caught the officer's attention was an area of the wall that had recently been painted over in white. Still, at first glance, there didn't appear to be any clear signs of a crime. There was nothing to suggest that something terrible had happened inside that apartment, but something felt off. Tynesha was still missing, and her family knew that she wouldn't have just vanished without a trace. What they didn't know was that the nightmare that they feared had already begun. After speaking to Timothy, an investigation was launched into Tynesha's disappearance. On March 20th, a search headquarters was set up at a local church. Most of the initial search focused on the woods around Timothy's apartment. Cadaver dogs were brought in and police and volunteers scoured the area for any sign of Tynesha, but she was nowhere to be found. The same day that the headquarters was set up for the search of Tynesha, the search took another turn when Sergeant Yvonne Cooper of the Harris County Sheriff's Department was dispatched to the church. Now, a crowd had gathered, and Timothy was reportedly on his way there. When Timothy arrived, Sergeant Cooper placed him in the back of her patrol car, citing concerns for his safety due to the growing tension among the people that had gathered. But she was clear about her intentions. Timothy was the last person known to have seen Tynesha, and she needed to question him further. Timothy agreed to provide a written statement, but when asked if he would consent to a search of his apartment and vehicle, he refused. Despite his initial refusal, Sergeant Cooper was able to obtain the keys to his apartment and the car before transporting him to the Harris County Sheriff's Department Homicide Division for further questioning. By 8:30 p.m., Timothy was sitting down with Sergeant Craig Clopton for an interview. It was during this conversation that Timothy finally agreed to allow authorities to search his apartment and vehicle. With Timothy's consent secured, Sergeant Cooper and two detectives conducted a search of his apartment that same evening. They meticulously combed through the space, looking for any sign that could explain Tynesha's disappearance. Almost immediately, the detectives noticed something troubling. Several areas of the apartment had been freshly painted, particularly in the bathroom. Now, this was a red flag, as freshly painted surfaces often indicate an attempt to conceal evidence. Using presumptive blood tests, they found positive results in several areas: behind the bathroom light switch, at the base of the toilet, and along the edge of the bathtub. The search had confirmed what they feared. Something terrible had likely happened within those walls. At this point, Tynesha had been missing for days, and while Timothy claimed that she had simply walked away, something about his story just didn't seem right. The fresh paint in his apartment, the way he avoided giving straight answers, it all felt off. But at that moment, there was still no hard evidence of what had happened to Tynesha. But the search was far from over. Tynesha's family was desperate for answers, and investigators weren't giving up. But they weren't the only ones pushing for the truth. A well-known community activist was about to step in, and when he confronted Timothy face-to-face, the story was about to take a shocking turn. On March 15th, 2007, 19-year-old Tynesha Stewart disappeared in Houston, Texas. The last person to see her was her ex-boyfriend, who said she left his apartment alive. But after his apartment was searched, detectives believed that there was way more to the story. After conducting a search on Timothy's apartment, the investigation was beginning to close in on him. Not only had evidence been found in his apartment that led investigators to believe that something had happened to Tynesha there, Timothy was the last person to see the missing college student. He, however, was sticking to his story. He insisted that Tynesha left his apartment after an argument. But as the investigation deepened, Quanell X, a well-known community activist and leader of the New Black Panthers, got involved. He met with Tynesha's family and vowed to help bring answers. On March 21st, during a meeting with the family, Quanell X received an unexpected phone call from Timothy. Timothy asked to meet, and he agreed. Initially, the two met at a nearby motel before then heading to Timothy's apartment together. Concerned that police may have planted listening devices, Timothy insisted that they talk in the bathroom. What happened during that conversation would soon shed light on the dark truth behind Tynesha's disappearance. Inside the bathroom of his apartment, Timothy started to unravel. His nervous energy was obvious. His breathing changed, his hands fidgeted, and he could barely maintain eye contact. Cornell X pressed him, asking him, "Are you sure you don't know what happened to this sister?" For a moment, Timothy hesitated, but instead of answering, he abruptly suggested that they leave the apartment and talk outside. It was clear that whatever weight he was carrying was getting heavier by the second. As they walked through the complex, heading toward the tennis courts, Timothy's anxiety spilled over. Quote, "Man, they're going to kill me," he suddenly said. "They're going to give me the death penalty." It was the first real sign that he knew exactly what happened to Tynesha. Cornell X, trying to keep him calm, suggested that he call his attorney. And after a brief conversation with his lawyer, Timothy seemed to relax, almost as if hearing from his attorney gave him permission to finally tell the truth. And that's when he made the decision. He was ready to lead them to where he said he put Tynesha. Now, Cornell X wasted no time contacting the sheriff's department, and a Sergeant Miller was dispatched and soon joined them in Cornell X's car. With Timothy in the passenger seat, they drove in silence as he guided them to another apartment complex. The tension in the car was thick. Everyone knew they were heading toward something grim, but no one spoke. Finally, Timothy directed them to the back of the complex where a large dumpster sat near the edge of the lot. The three men got out of the car and walked up to the dumpster. Cornell X asked Timothy the question that no one wanted to hear the answer to. "Tim, is this where you put her?" There was no hesitation this time. Yes, Timothy admitted. The weight of his confession hung in the air, but before anyone could say another word, Sergeant Miller moved in. Timothy Shepard was officially under arrest. After arriving at the station, Timothy was photographed and then he gave a statement to police, confessing to the murder of Tynesha Stewart. But Timothy claimed that it was an act of self-defense. In his confession, he claimed that he confronted Tynesha about the fact that she was seeing someone else, and he said that they got into an argument about it, and he ended up pushing her. He said that she then pulled a knife out and swung it at him. Timothy said that she cut his finger and that he was scared that she was going to stab him, and so he grabbed her and then strangled her to death. After he realized that she was dead, Timothy said that he panicked, and instead of calling police, he decided to dispose of Tynesha's body. He went to a hardware store and purchased a jigsaw, which he then used to dismember Tynesha. He said that he then placed the remains in a plastic container that he put in his apartment dumpster, but police only believed part of that confession. They did believe that Timothy had dismembered Tynesha, but they did not believe that her body was placed in the dumpster, at least not all of it, and no remains were ever found in the dumpster. But on the evening of March 16th, the day after Tynesha vanished, firefighters were called to Timothy's apartment at around 7:45 p.m. When they knocked, Timothy answered the door, clearly confused about why they were there, but it turned out that a neighbor had called 911 after witnessing huge flames shooting from a grill on his patio. The fire had been so intense that it nearly set the balcony roof ablaze, prompting the neighbor to worry that the entire complex could catch on fire. But by the time the firefighters arrived, the flames were under control. However, they insisted on entering the apartment to ensure that there was no more danger. Timothy was reluctant, but eventually he let them in. After an inspection, the firefighters said that they found no immediate signs of trouble, except for some oddities. In the bathtub, they spotted pieces of meat, including rib bones floating in water. In the kitchen, there were charred remnants of what appeared to be meat on the stove. Now, those firefighters would later testify that they thought it was chicken, but the detectives working the case don't believe that what they saw was chicken. As part of their investigation, police also spoke to Timothy's neighbors to see what they knew. His neighbors told detectives that for 2 or 3 days straight, they were overwhelmed by the sharp stench of something burning. The source of the odor was his apartment balcony. Heavy black smoke and flames poured from 2 barbecue grills where he had been cooking continuously. The smell wasn't that of grilling meat. Neighbors said it smelled worse than burnt hair or tires. Day and night, Timothy worked on the patio. A neighbor later said that they saw Timothy taking both grills to the dumpster. Neighbors also noted that even though the weather was cool, they noticed that Timothy had all of his windows open, fans running inside, and his air conditioning blasting. They also observed a constant sound of running water for 2 days, along with the occasional hum of his garbage disposal, which would run for minutes at a time. Police would uncover more than 100 pieces of evidence from Timothy's apartment that would be crucial for his trial. But the most chilling discoveries were yet to come. Now, while searching the garbage disposal, police found human teeth and bone fragments. And on the patio, they found several burned bone fragments with jagged cut marks. In total, 30 bone fragments were recovered. DNA testing on the teeth confirmed the worst. The DNA matched that of Tynesha Stewart. In October 2008, Timothy Shepard's trial began. His defense attorney tried to argue that this was an act of self-defense, despite the fact that Tynesha was dismembered. But the evidence against Timothy was overwhelming, and the prosecution presented evidence that proved that this was not self-defense. They believed Timothy killed Tynesha in a jealous rage, and the jury agreed. On October 9th, 2008, Timothy Wayne Shepard was found guilty, and he was sentenced to 99 years in prison. Tynesha was a bright, ambitious young woman with her whole life ahead of her. She had worked hard to get where she was, overcoming obstacles and making her family really proud. But in the end, none of that mattered to Timothy Shepard. He took her life in a way that was not only brutal, but heartless, robbing her family of the chance to ever see her again, to say her goodbye, to lay her to rest. The loss of Tynesha left an unimaginable void in the lives of those who loved her. Her mother, her siblings, her friends. They were forced to grieve without answers, without justice that could ever feel like enough. The weight of what was taken from them is something that they will carry forever. Tynesha deserved so much more than the fate that she was given. She deserved to graduate, to chase her dreams, to live her life full of joy and love. But instead, her story became a tragedy, one that should have never happened. May Tynesha Stewart rest in peace. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, and Threads.